So this is my first attempt at doing a knitting tutorial because I had so much interest in my little dragon gloves, and I did have quite a few people ask if I could do a tutorial, so I thought I would give it a go. Because I do feel like this is a really perfect beginner's pattern, that it's very, very easy, but it's not boring. It's not boring like a scarf. It's got scales on, and that keeps it interesting. I really enjoy doing it, even though I've made about 4 pairs now. I still really enjoy them. So as a result, I've aimed this pattern at complete beginners who've never knitted before, because I feel like if you can knit at all, you don't need me to tell you how to do this. You can just buy the pattern that I'm going to link below. It's not my pattern, I'm not making any money off it, it's just the pattern I base these gloves on. So yeah, if you knit at all, just buy that pattern, you'll work it out, it's fine. So I wanted to aim this at complete beginners. As a result, I was trying to be really basic and really simple and really step by step. And it got a bit long, it got really quite long. So what I'm going to do, I will leave you below all the time signatures of the different steps in this video so that you can skip to the relevant point as you go through without ploughing through like freaking 40 minutes of footage or something. So yeah, so the changes I've made to the pattern, if you were to knit the pattern exactly as it says below, you would be knitting it on normal knitting needles like this, and you would be knitting it flat. So what it would give you is just a big rectangle which you would then have to sew up into a glove, and there's no thumb on it either, it's just got a hole for a thumb. I hate that, I hate having gloves without thumbs. So what I've done with this pattern to change it is, rather than knitting it flat, I'm knitting it in a circle with a set of these things, which means that the glove comes out glove shaped. You don't have to sew it up or anything, it comes out glove shaped, and I've added a little thumb, as you can see, with Elizabeth Zimmerman's thumb trick, which I will show you in the tutorial. So the only differences this really makes to the pattern and to following the pattern, because yes, if you're going to do the tutorial, I would say buy the pattern anyway. I felt like I couldn't give you every single detail of the sizing and everything in this tutorial, because although I've changed it quite a lot, I'm still basing it so much on that pattern that I feel it would basically be copyright infringement if I gave you all the details. So to err on the safe side, I would say buy that pattern, and that will give you the sizing of the gloves and all of that stuff, and I think it can be quite helpful to follow a pattern and to get used to following a pattern also. So even if you're going to do the tutorial, get the pattern and it will probably make a lot more sense to you. But big warning with the pattern versus the tutorial, the main thing that makes a huge difference when you're knitting circular versus knitting straight is that in the pattern, when you're knitting straight, you're knitting, you know, back and forth like this. So you're knitting on one side, then you're turning it and knitting on the other side. And that means that to make this particular stitch, which is garter stitch, the only stitch you need is knit. You knit on all sides, you just knit the whole damn thing. But for these gloves, knitting round in a circle, because you're always on the same side of the knitting, you have to alternate the rows. You have to do knit and purl throughout, which is, I'm going to show you, but I just needed to warn you before you see the pattern and get confused. So where it says knit all the way through, ignore that, do what I'm going to tell you to do. But throughout this tutorial, I'm giving you the right glove. I'm only going to give you one glove because obviously it would be like an hour and a half if I gave you both gloves. So this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to knit the right glove. I apologise, I kept calling it the left glove in the tutorial. Ignore that, it's the right glove. I realised that when I got to the thumb. I was like, it's the right one. So yeah, in this tutorial, I'm showing you how to knit the right glove, and if you get the Crafty Muck pattern, that will show you easily enough how to flip what you're doing and make kind of the opposite glove. But basically, what you're doing is you're just kind of reversing where the scales are. So where in the pattern I'm about to give you for the right glove, the scales are at the beginning. For the left glove, you would just be putting the scales at the end. So you just count the amount of stitches you use for the scales and you put it at the end, and that's, you know, the simplification of how you do it. So what I will also leave you below is I will leave you a shopping list of all the things you need, but to show you very quickly the things you need a ball of yarn, pretty average sized ball of yarn, and the weight of yarn you need is called Aran or worsted. It's exactly the same thing, it's just got 2 names. And you know, that can be any colour you like, and it will just give you this part down here, so whatever colour you want it to be. You will also need a very small amount of a different coloured yarn. Now this yarn is just scrap yarn and it gets taken out at the end. It doesn't show in your final glove. So it doesn't matter what colour it is, you just want it to be a very strikingly different colour so that it's easy to tell apart from your real yarn. Then also you will need a set of double pointed needles. Oh my god, my battery's running out. You need a set of double pointed needles which look like this. They generally come in sets of 4 or 5, and I only need 4 for this pattern. These are 4mm needles. I will leave you the American size below because I can't remember it off the top of my head. Other things you need: pair of scissors and a darning needle. Can't find mine to show you, but a darning needle is basically just a big fat sewing needle that you can get yarn into the eye of. And then finally, a good thing to have is a little knitting counter like this, so you can keep count of your stitches. But if you haven't got one of those, you could just use 2 different coloured pens to keep your 2 tallies going. Oh, and of course the final thing you're going to need is dragon scales, which look like this. They're kind of little scaly things with a hole in the top, and I get mine from Etsy. They come in all different colours. I will link you to my favourite Etsy supplier, but if you're in America, I would say have a look on eBay first. You might find them cheaper because the scales are the expensive part, that it costs round about $40 to make a pair of gloves with the amount of scales you need, which is a pain in the arse, admittedly. So I would say try eBay first. And that's basically everything you need. I will, as I say, I'll leave you the shopping list below. I will leave you the time signatures below so you can skip through to the relevant points in the video. I will leave you the Crafty Muck pattern, and I will leave you my favourite scale supplier. And if you get stuck on anything, feel free to ask me in the comments. If it turns out there's a bit in the video that people are confused by, I will try and make another little video to clarify it. But what would probably be quite a quick thing to do is, if you get stuck on anything, put into the YouTube search bar knitting techniques and the stitch that you're stuck on, and you will probably get a very clear video by someone who's done loads of knitting tutorials and knows what they're doing better than I do. But yeah, I hope this makes sense to everyone, and I hope it gets you knitting, and I hope you get your own lovely dragon scale gloves very soon. And yes, if it gets lots of people knitting, maybe I can talk more about knitting and get people into more knitting patterns and stuff. That would be awesome. So yeah, I hope this makes sense, and apologies for it being so long. So yeah, here we go, knitting, yay! Okay, this is my first attempt at filming my own hands knitting. It's going to be a little bit weird and bizarre. So you're starting off with a cast on just to get the stitches on the needles in the first place. There's 1,000,001 ways you can do a cast on, but I'm going to show you the long tail method because it's my personal favourite. It makes it quite quick to get all the stitches on. And obviously you need to by now work out how many stitches you're going to need for the size of gloves you're doing. I'm going to use 32 stitches for Jamie's gloves because I knit quite tightly, so I need to upsize a little bit. So basically what you're doing, when you know how many stitches you want, you're going to be arranging them fairly evenly over 3 sticks to make a triangle. But to start with, you want your tail of yarn, and as the name suggests, this is the long tail cast on, so you want a big long tail. So chuck a load of yarn over here, so you've got the tail on this end and you've got a great big ball of yarn over here, and then you want to drape the yarn around your fingers like this, and then take just one of the sticks, and you start by picking up this piece downwards, and then you pick up this piece over here. You don't want to grab this one at the back too, you take it over, and then you take this piece over here and bring it through this gap, and then pull it, not too tight but kind of a bit tight. So I'll just show you that again. This I know this bit kind of looks a little bit fiddly, but honestly it gets easier once the stitches are on. It's much less fiddly. So taking it down, picking this piece up, then picking this piece up and bringing it through and kind of pulling it tight, and that gives you 2 stitches. That gives you your first 2 stitches, and then at this point you've got this kind of like boomerang thing, I don't know what you call it, and then you go and you pick this bottom piece up and again bring it over that piece, and then grab this piece, bring it through the gap, and that gives you 1 stitch, and then you just keep doing exactly what I've just shown you. This through here, pick up the bottom piece, pick up that piece, bring it through the gap, that piece, and you just keep doing that. So at this point I'm gonna move to a different stick. What you can do if you want it to be easier is just cast them all on one stick and then move them, but it tends to be quicker to just keep casting them on onto a different stick. So I'm doing exactly the same thing, it's just a little bit more fiddly because I've got this corner going on here. So once you've got them on the first stick, once you've got the first stitch on rather, it becomes easier, and you just keep on going. And then when you hit another corner, you do exactly the same thing and move on to the third stick. And you don't want to pull these stitches too tight because you're making gloves, so they need to be stretchy, and it's also quite difficult to knit into the first stitches if you pull them tight, so you want them a little bit baggy. Okay, so once you've got all your stitches on and you've counted to make sure there's the right number, you probably want to give this long tail a bit of a snip. You want to leave some tail trailing, but you don't want it to be unmanageably long, so I'm going to get rid of this massive piece over here and just throw it in the bin. And then what is a very good thing to do is to tie a double knot in these two pieces of yarn, because this cast on can unravel if you cut the yarn too short at any point and it unravels. So I tend to find it a good thing to do to tie a knot. You want to make sure you're not tightening up that stitch too much. God, this is really difficult, sorry, this is such a weird angle. It's not very easy to find somewhere in my room where I can do this, but all I've done is just tied a little double knot in these so that it's not going to unravel. So now we can start knitting. Okay, so ignore the fact that the yarn has clearly changed colour here. I just wanted to re-record this bit because watching it back I feel like I didn't explain myself very well. So what I want to do before we kind of launch into the pattern, I just want to show you really clearly the knit and purl stitches for this. That, as I say, those are the only things you're going to need. That you knit one row, you purl one row, then you put the scales on, but you continue with the knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, all the way through. So you just need to know how to knit and purl. So before we start the pattern, I want to show you those things, and I'm going to show you two ways to do each stitch, because there's British knitting where you've got the yarn on this side, which is very easy to pick up, and you will need to know how to do this to put the dragon scales on, because it really doesn't work the other way. But knitting like this all the time is quite slow. So then I also want to show you continental knitting where you have the yarn on this side, which I prefer because it's a lot faster. Both ways, what you're creating, it's exactly the same result. It comes out looking exactly the same, it's just two ways to do the same stitch. So to start with the British way, you've got the yarn over here, and I tend to wrap it around my little finger so I can keep it tight. And then for the knit stitch, you insert the needle this way from kind of left to right, just through the front part of the loop like that. Then the yarn is always at the back with a knit stitch, and you wrap it around this needle and down in between, and you pull it through and you knock that stitch off. And then when you're at the corner of the stitch, the corner of the sticks, you want to kind of pull it quite tight to pull them together, and you just keep on doing that with the knit stitch. So you go in that way, wrap it around and between, pull it through, knock the stitch off, and you just keep on going. And that is the knit stitch with British knitting. So then if you're going to switch to purling with British knitting, you bring the yarn through here, so it's in the front now, and you insert the needle. A purl stitch is basically just a knit stitch backwards. So like these stitches, they're knit on this side, and on this side they're purl stitches. So a purl is just kind of backwards of a knit stitch. So you insert the needle for a purl stitch this way from right to left, and you wrap the yarn again around the needle like that, and then you kind of pull it through the back, knock the stitch off, and you just keep on doing that. So ooh, I'm so bad at British knitting, I don't do it anymore, I'm no good at it. Pull it through, knock it off, stick it in this way, wrap it around, pull it through, knock it off, and then to go back to knitting this way, the yarn comes over that way into the back, and then you continue knitting as before. So that's the difference between knit and purl stitches with British knitting. And obviously the problem with this is that it's quite slow to change between the two stitches, which isn't something that really affects this pattern, but hopefully if you progress with knitting and you end up doing something more complex, it will become a pain in your arse, which is why continental knitting is quite a good thing, that it's kind of a lot faster when it comes to that with continental knitting, you've got the yarn on this side in your left hand, so again I wrap it around my finger like so, then you've got the yarn coming over your index finger from back to front, And for a knit stitch, again, the yarn is in the back. You insert the needle just as before, but rather than wrapping the yarn with your finger, you kind of pick up the yarn with the needle. So you take the needle, can you see what I'm doing, over the back of this string, and then you just pick it up downwards and through and knock it off. And then you just keep doing the same thing. So you go into the stitch the same way, over the stitch, over the yarn at the back, pull it through, knock it off, in, pick it up, pull it through, knock it off. And then to move to a purl stitch with this kind of knitting, you just bring the yarn like this, which is a lot quicker to kind of flick backwards and forwards rather than moving it with this hand. So for a purl stitch with Continental, the yarn again comes into the front, and you're doing pretty much the same thing really. You insert the needle from right to left, and then you just wrap the yarn with your finger and pull it through and knock it off. And you continue doing that. And that is basically the 2 stitches with both methods. So now I will begin the pattern. Okay, so to finally launch into the pattern, this pattern begins with 2 preparatory rows. So you've got 1 row of knit, 1 row of purl, and then you start putting the scales on and the proper pattern repeats begin. So what you should have done at this point, you should have cast on your stitches, and you want to, obviously you've cast them on, you've got a load of kind of messy sticks, you want to bring them round so you've got them in a little triangle, and the ones with the strings hanging off, you want to be on the right. And it's quite important to make sure you don't have any twists in your stitches. So if you can see the stitches kind of cross over at any point, that's a twist. You want this knitted part to kind of run smoothly around the bottom so there's no twists in it. So at this point you then want to make sure you've got the right bit of string, that one of these bits of string is going to be the tail, and you don't want that. You want to be knitting with the piece of string that connects to the ball of yarn. So take that and decide whether you're going to knit British style or Continental style. I'm going to knit Continental style, so I've got the yarn over here, and starting with this stick you slide the stitches kind of towards the point, and then you pick up your free needle and you start, as I say, with the knit row. So inserting left to right, yarn in the back, picking up the yarn, and you want to make sure that you give it a good yank to get the sticks tight together, and then you just keep on knitting. I'm making a mess of this, but it doesn't matter because this is only a demonstrative bit of knitting. It doesn't matter if I make a mess. Now you might find that the stitches are a little bit tight and awkward to begin with. Knitting into a cast on is always kind of the most awkward row. It does get easier once you're knitting into knitted stitches rather than cast on stitches. And then when you get to this corner and you've got no stitches left on this needle, you just scooch the stitches down so they're not going to fall off. You move the empty stick into your right hand, and then you kind of move over, and it helps if you bring the stick you're working on to the front at both ends. And again, if you're knitting, the yarn needs to be in the back behind that stick, and you just keep on knitting again. And eventually you will have reached another corner, so just do the same thing again. Move the stitches down, empty stick in your right hand, move it all over, and just keep on knitting down this third stick. Again, giving it a good yank at the corner to keep it all tight. And eventually you will have knitted around your 3 sticks, and you will have made it all the way back to your tail of yarn, which means that you've completed the round. There's quite a lot of good reasons for keeping the tail trailing off, and one of them is that you can always see when you've reached the end of the round that if you're kind of disturbed in the middle of knitting, it doesn't really matter where you stop, because you will always know where the end of the round is, because it's the corner with the yarn tail dangling. So once you've done this first knit round, you want to do a purl round, so you continue as before but just with purl stitches. So yeah, yarn is in the front, needles inserting kind of that way instead, wrap the yarn, pull it through, knock it off, again give it a good yank, and you just keep on going with purl stitches, and you just do exactly the same thing. So you go all the way round to the tail of yarn, all the way around your 3 stitches to the tail of yarn, and at that point the scale part of the pattern will begin. And I will return to my original footage and hopefully the rest of it will make sense. Now, a couple of little things I wanted to show you just before I go on to that. To start with, if you pick up your knitting kind of halfway through and you can't work out which way up it is and which way you're going, you will always find that the stitches you've been knitting into will have the tail of yarn dangling directly from that stitch. So you always go that way. So rather, you know, if you pick it up this way, you can see the tail of yarn is on the wrong side, so you're upside down. So you want it to be going from yarn into no yarn, so you're always going to go that way. And you don't necessarily have to always stop at the end of a stick. If you kind of knit a few stitches and you get disturbed, you can always just stop there, so long as you've kind of slid the stitches up so they're not going to fall off. You can quite happily leave it like that and it will be fine. Now, one final thing to show you is unpicking stitches, that if you cock anything up, the easiest way to kind of unpick stitches without everything going horribly wrong is to just stick your needle into the stitch below and then just drop that stitch off there and pull it out and just keep going along, unpicking them one by one, and that way you can't really cock it up completely and unravel it. So yeah, so hopefully that kind of gives you the basics to get started, and now we will return to the original footage and to putting the dragon scales on. Yay! Okay, so once you've done your 2 rows, 1 row of knit, 1 row of purl, you are ready to start putting the scales on. And this is the point at which really you need the Crafty Muck pattern to see where you're going to put your scales. So I'm going to start with the left glove, because obviously you need 1 right glove and 1 left glove for a pair. So the left glove is a little bit easier to show you where to put the scales. The right glove needs a little bit more kind of stitch counting. So for the left glove, you want to start with your scales, and if you're going to do like a chaotic colour mixture, I would recommend dumping them all in a bowl, give them a mix, and it looks like masses. It looks like so many scales, but that's literally just a pair of gloves. So on each row that has scales on, you use 6 scales. So I tend to get out 6 scales so that they're ready and you don't put on too many or too few. When I put the scales on, I tend to revert to British knitting. It's a lot easier to put scales on with the yarn in your right hand. The scales, basically, you put them on a 4-row repeat. So you do a scale row, then you do a purl row with no scales on, then you do a scale row that's slightly offset to the first row, and then you do a purl row, and that's your pattern repeat, basically, those 4 rows. And you repeat those 4 rows 16 times. So for the first of the scale rows on the left glove, you knit 2 stitches without any scales. So you do 1, 2, oops, get the yarn out of the way, and this is the point at which you start putting the scales on. So to put a scale on, you start to knit the stitch as normal, but then you grab a scale and you want it curving down. You can see it curves up and it curves down. You want it curving down. You drop it on your needle over like that, and you put the yarn round like you normally would, and then you pull the yarn through the hole in the scale, through the stitch and off the needle, and then you just knit the next stitch normally, and that kind of, oops, my yarn's in the way, that kind of anchors the scale on, and you just keep doing that with all the scales. Drop them over, wrap the yarn as normal, pull it through the scale, pull it through the stitch, then you do a normal stitch, and my yarn is really in the way, and you just keep on going until you've got all 6 scales knitted on. This can be a little bit kind of awkward to begin with, but you do get used to it quite quickly. Okay, and now you can see I've still got 1 scale left and I've run out of stitches. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move over 3 stitches, because that's quite a good number. It's quite nice to have all your scales on one stick. It's much less confusing. So I'm just going to move 3 stitches onto this needle and slide that back, and then I can continue knitting. So I can just put this, what am I doing? Put this scale on the end And then, whoops, all my scales are on one needle, and that's going to be easier, and it's also going to mean that there's no kind of gaps or anything between my scales where it, because you do occasionally get a little bit of looseness where you're like in the corner of your sticks. So that is all the scales on for round one. So at this point I'm just going to continue knitting plain all the way around to the end of the row. And then when I've knitted all the way around to the end of the row and reached my little tail, I'm going to click my clicker so I know where I'm at. And at this point you just do a row of purl with no scales on it whatsoever. So you just purl all the way around as you did before. And you can find sometimes the stitches are a little bit tight over the top of the scales, but it's not really the end of the world. Now that I've purled all the way around to my little tail, I'm going to click my clicker again. That's 2 rows. So now it's time for more scales. So I'm going to count out another 6 scales. 6, that'll do. And as I say, you want the scales to be very slightly offset. So the scales kind of go in and out like this by 1 stitch. So where I knitted 2 plain stitches on the first row, on this third row I'm going to knit 3 stitches before I put the scales on. So it's just going to be offset by 1 stitch. So 3 plain stitches, and then you can start putting the scales on as before. As I say, you want 1 plain stitch between every scale. So you do a scale, then a plain stitch, then a scale until you run out of scales. And you will find that the scales look kind of jumbled and kind of chaotic and crazy when you first start doing it, but they will, once the whole thing's knitted and it's stretched out and on a person, they even out and they look lovely. So don't worry about them looking kind of chaotic and crazy to begin with. That's just how they look. So once I've done that, I'm just going to continue knitting all the way around as before, returning to continental style because it's faster. And then when I've knitted all the way around to my little tail, wherever my tail's gone, there's my tail, and I'm there. So I'm going to click my clicker, that's round 3. So again, now I just do a purl round with no scales on it. Okay, so now that I've purled all the way around to my tail, I click my clicker and now I'm at row 4, which means it's the end of the pattern repeat, and I can start my tally chart and reset my counter to 0. And that's basically it. So that is the pattern repeat. So first row, scales, second row, purl, third row, scales, 1 stitch offset, fourth row purl, and then you add a little tally chart and you start all over again. So I'm just going to keep on doing that until I've got 11 on my tally chart. Once I've got 11, we do something else. So keep on going. Yay!